I was abandoned by my own daughter in a remote nursing home where my phone was taken, my property secretly transferred, and all while she stood inside my house smiling and saying, "My mother already agreed." If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to catch the next shocking episodes we have in store. Under the soft hum of a grandfather clock and the whispering rustle of pine trees brushing against the windows, Evelyn Carter sat in her faded wingback chair, a steaming mug of chamomile in her hands. The morning light spilled across the wooden floor in delicate patches, brushing against the threadbare rug that had once been rich burgundy. Everything inside the cottage bore the mark of time, not decay but memory. The house on the hill had once been alive with sound laughter, footsteps, jazz music drifting from the kitchen radio, her husband's deep voice booming across the hallway. But now the silence was her only companion, broken occasionally by the creak of settling wood or the chirp of a distant bird. It was a silence Evelyn had learned to both fear and respect, the kind that demanded you listen to your own thoughts. She wore her solitude like a shawl, wrapping herself in it each morning as she brewed tea, watered the azaleas, and dusted the mantel where Harold's old Navy photo stood. She whispered to him sometimes, just a word or two. Sometimes she caught herself reaching for a second mug before remembering she no longer needed it. Then came the sound of tires crunching gravel. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't need to look. She knew the rhythm of that engine, the careful way the door clicked shut. Melissa was here. "Mom!" The voice rang out with practiced cheerfulness. The front door opened before Evelyn could respond, the hinges groaning in protest. Melissa swept in with her oversized handbag and perfume that smelled like magnolia drowning in mint. Evelyn smiled, automatic thin. "You always just barge in like that." I knocked. Melissa grinned, kissing her mother's cheek. "You just didn't hear it. You need a better doorbell. Or maybe a new door altogether. Honestly, Mom, this house is charming, but it's ancient." Evelyn glanced around her. The house was wood and stone, yes, built in 1947, but it had weathered storms, births, funerals, and quiet victories. It didn't creak out of weakness, it spoke. "I like the sound it makes," Evelyn said. "It tells me someone's here." Melissa's smile faltered for a beat. "Right. Well, I brought you those vitamin supplements Dr. Hayward mentioned, and I picked up some of those ginger chews you like." She moved through this kitchen like a breeze, opening cabinets, rearranging things, tucking boxes away in places Evelyn would never remember. Evelyn just watched. Melissa was always moving. Her conversations came in waves. Small talk rolled into subtle critiques, which then bled into suggestions she called gentle nudges. "Mom," she said now, opening the fridge and grimacing, "are you seriously still eating this canned stuff? I can't even pronounce half these labels. You know, if you moved in with me, you'd have proper meals, a comfortable bed, someone around if something ever happened." Evelyn raised a brow. "Something like what?" "Slipping in my own kitchen." Melissa chuckled, but it was forced. "I'm just saying, you're 72, Mom. You shouldn't be living up here by yourself." "I'm not by myself," Evelyn replied, her voice calm. "I've got Harold's ashes and a dozen squirrels to keep me company." "That's not funny," Melissa said. "You shouldn't joke like that." "I'm not joking." Melissa sat across from her, now folding her manicured hands. Her lipstick was too pink, too rehearsed. "I'm serious," she said. "This house is old, isolated. It's time, Mom. You need to be somewhere safer, more modern, with people." "With you, you mean?" "Of course with me." "Why not? You'll have your own room and I work from home most days. You can garden, go for walks, and I can take you to your appointments. No more worrying about icy stairs or power outages." Evelyn sipped her tea. "What about the house?" Melissa's eyes darted toward the window. "You'd sell it, obviously. We can get a good price before winter sets in. Maybe even do some renovations first. I can help you organize everything." The silence that followed was different, denser. Evelyn set her mug down with a quiet clink. "This house," she began, her voice low, "is where your father took his last breath. Where you took your first steps. Where we celebrated 25 Christmases. You think I can just hand over those walls for a few $1,000s? Melissa softened her tone, leaned forward. I know it means something to you, Mom. I do. But it's just stuff. Bricks and beams. You always told me people matter more. And I meant it, Evelyn replied. But this isn't just a house. It's everything I built, everything I held on to. Melissa sat back, folding her arms. I just want what's best for you. And what if this quiet, this wind, this creaking wood is what's best for me? Melissa didn't answer right away. She opened her bag, pulled out a brochure, and slid it across the table. Just look, she said. It's not a nursing home or anything scary. It's a wellness retreat, a quiet getaway, a place for people your age to recharge. They have yoga, cooking classes, even guided nature walks. Evelyn stared at the glossy image of an elderly couple smiling on a balcony. Their hair was gray, their faces smooth. They didn't look real. I don't need recharging, she said quietly. But it's just for a few days, Melissa insisted. You've been cooped up here for too long. You barely leave the house. Come on, Mom. Think of it like a vacation. I'll drive you up myself. You'll get some air, maybe meet someone. Who knows? Could be good for your soul. Evelyn walked to the window and looked out. The sky was streaked with the colors of autumn. Her trees were turning amber and gold. The same trees Harold had planted with his bare hands. The same ones she had watched bloom and wither and bloom again. I don't know, she murmured. Melissa stood too, placing a hand on her mother's shoulder. Just think about it, please. For me, there it was. That tone. The one that carried 100 invisible strings. Evelyn didn't answer. Her silence was a shield. Melissa took that as a maybe. I'll pick you up Friday morning, she said, kissing her mother's temple. Pack light, just the basics. Evelyn's reflection in the window didn't move. The trees swayed, the wind curled against the glass. She felt Harold in that breeze, heard him in the floorboards moan, and deep in her gut a cold knot began to twist, quiet, unexplainable, but real. She didn't know what it was yet, but it was the beginning. Under a pale gray sky, Evelyn Carter stepped off the porch with her overnight bag in hand. It was Friday morning, just as Melissa had said, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and falling leaves. A chill bit at her fingertips, even through her gloves. The old wooden swing creaked in the breeze behind her, a ghost of a summer long gone. Melissa's SUV sat idling at the bottom of the gravel path, pristine, polished, out of place against the wild backdrop of pine and fog. She leaned against the driver's door, scrolling through her phone with one hand and sipping a smoothie with the other. When she saw Evelyn approaching, she flashed a smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. "Right on time, Mom," she said brightly, taking the bag and tossing it into the back seat with a casual thud. Evelyn hesitated before sliding into the passenger seat. Her knees protested the motion, and the seat was too low, too cold. Melissa adjusted the heater and the radio at the same time, the car filling with warm air and soft jazz. "Got everything?" Melissa asked, pulling out of the driveway. "Just the basics," Evelyn replied, clutching her purse a little tighter than usual. Inside was her phone, her wallet, Harold's old pocket knife, and a notebook, just in case. The trees passed by in blurs of amber and rust, but Evelyn noticed something else. They weren't taking the usual highway north. Melissa had turned west, a winding, narrower route she hadn't seen in decades. "Where exactly is this place again?" Evelyn asked, adjusting her seatbelt. Melissa kept her gaze on the road. "It's a little off the beaten path, tucked away in the hills, very peaceful. I thought you'd like that. Less traffic, less noise." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She watched the familiar landmarks fade behind them, the old general store with its rusted tin roof, the white church with the crooked steeple, the library with the broken clock. In their place came long stretches of road flanked by nothing but tangled forest and overgrown ditches. The signal on her phone dropped to 1 bar. "Seems pretty remote," Evelyn said, trying to keep her tone neutral. Melissa chuckled. "That's the whole point, disconnect from everything. No more stress, no more screens, just nature and clean air." Evelyn gave a small nod, but something inside her shifted like a chair, slightly off balance. As they drove deeper, the trees grew denser, the canopy above thickening until the sunlight barely filtered through. The paved road turned into gravel, then dirt. The GPS on the dashboard blinked twice before going black. Melissa tapped the screen. Ugh, useless in the woods. Good thing I've got it memorized. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her purse. It was another 15 minutes before the car pulled up to a rusted metal gate. A sign dangled from one hinge, the letters worn and flaking. Whispering Pines Wellness Retreat. Beyond the gate, a cracked asphalt path led through a dying orchard. The trees were bare skeletal. A few blackbirds flapped overhead, scattering like secrets in the wind. Evelyn stared out the windshield. This doesn't look like the brochure. Melissa gave a nervous laugh. The main lodge is just a little further up. Don't judge a book by its cover. She pressed a buzzer on the gate's intercom, and after a moment, a voice crackled through. Name, Melissa Carter. I'm dropping off Evelyn Carter for a short-term stay. The gate creaked open slowly, unwillingly, like it didn't want to let them in. As they drove through, Evelyn's stomach coiled tighter. The trees pressed in like walls. The lodge came into view, not the bright, airy building from the pamphlet, but a square gray structure with peeling paint and barred basement windows. 2 wings stretched out from the center like broken arms. The air smelled of mildew and old smoke. Melissa pulled to a stop in front of the entrance. A nurse stood waiting on the steps, clipboard in hand. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair tied back too tight. She did not smile. Well, here we are, Melissa announced too loudly. Evelyn didn't move. A man stepped out behind the nurse, tall, gaunt, wearing a brown windbreaker with no badge. He nodded once, unsmiling. Melissa got out and opened Evelyn's door. Come on, Mom. Just a few days. You'll feel so much better. I'll call and visit, promise. Evelyn stepped out slowly, eyes scanning the building, the windows, the emptiness. A crow landed on the roof and let out a single echoing caw. Inside the main doors, the air changed. Stale, dry, overwarmed. The lobby was dim, furnished in dusty beige. An old clock ticked too loudly on the wall, and a water cooler burbled with an unsettling gurgle. The nurse handed Melissa a stack of papers. Authorization to release medical oversight, dietary preferences, emergency contacts, standard stuff. Evelyn raised a brow. That's a lot of paperwork for a weekend. Melissa waved it off. Just policy. The nurse smiled at Evelyn, thin, cold. Let's get you settled. May I have your purse and phone, ma'am? We keep all personal items secure in our safe for the duration of your stay. Promotes relaxation. Evelyn's fingers dug into the strap of her bag. I'd rather keep them. It's mandatory, the nurse said firmly. Melissa stepped closer. Come on, Mom. It's just a little break. No distractions. You'll get everything back when you leave. Evelyn looked at her daughter. Something flickered in Melissa's eyes. Impatience, maybe. Or something colder. I'm not comfortable. Mom, Melissa interrupted. Please, just do this. For me. For a moment the room held its breath. Then Evelyn reluctantly handed over her bag. Her fingers brushed the worn leather one last time before letting go. The nurse turned and walked away with it. Melissa gave her mother a quick hug, too quick. I've got to run. Traffic's going to be a nightmare getting back. But I'll call first thing Monday, okay? She kissed Evelyn's cheek, stepped out into the sunlight, and was gone. Evelyn watched through the glass doors as the SUV backed out and disappeared beyond the trees. The gate creaked shut behind it. She stood in the lobby, heart thudding slow and heavy. A bell rang. The nurse reappeared. Follow me. They walked down a narrow hallway with flickering lights. Doors lined the walls, each one closed tight. There was no music, no chatter, just the distant hum of something mechanical and the wheeze of the heater. Evelyn's room was small. A single bed, metal framed. A window that didn't open. No phone, no clock. The only decoration was a faded landscape painting nailed crookedly to the wall. There's a welcome packet on the desk, the nurse said, already turning away. Dinner's at 6. Evelyn closed the door and leaned against it. Silence. She moved to the window and tried the latch. It was bolted. The glass was thick and slightly fogged. Outside, the orchard twisted in the wind like restless hands. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening. Nothing. Then a low murmur from the hall. Footsteps, a door slamming. She stood, opened the small desk drawer. Empty. No pen, no paper. Her phone, her wallet gone. Evelyn paced slowly, fingers trailing the wallpaper's peeling edge. Her eyes landed on the welcome packet, 2 sheets of paper badly photocopied, rules, meal times, no outside contact. Her breath came shallower now. This wasn't a wellness retreat. This was something else, something worse. She moved to the door and turned the handle. Locked. From the outside, her chest tightened. She sat back down, her eyes scanning every corner. No cameras, no intercom, just 4 walls and a broken promise. She looked at the bed, neatly made, too neatly. She thought of Harold. She thought of Melissa's voice in the car, too cheerful, too quick. She thought of the moment the nurse took her bag, how her daughter didn't even flinch. And suddenly Evelyn understood what had happened. She wasn't on a vacation. She wasn't meant to rest. She was meant to disappear. The second night in Whispering Pines was colder than the first. Evelyn sat upright in bed, the threadbare blanket pulled up to her chest, though it did little against the chill. The radiator hissed like a tired animal in the corner, cycling air that felt more stale than warm. Outside her window, the orchard twisted under the wind again, those skeletal trees dancing their silent, frantic ballet. The light bulb above her flickered every few minutes as if unsure whether to stay lit or give up. But it wasn't the cold that kept her awake. It was the feeling that someone was watching, not in the traditional sense. There were no eyes peeking through windows, no creaks in the hallway that sounded like deliberate steps. No. It was the emptiness itself that felt predatory, the way the silence hung too long, the way every nurse walked with robotic precision, their eyes avoiding hers, like she was a room they didn't want to enter. She had asked for a phone call that morning politely. The nurse, the same one who'd taken her purse, had smiled like a painting and said, "Unfortunately, Mrs. Carter, outside contact is discouraged during acclimation. But you'll be able to write a letter next week." Next week? Evelyn didn't plan to be here next week. At breakfast, the residents, all women over 60, sat silently at long tables, spoons clinking against ceramic bowls like distant echoes. No one spoke. No one laughed. They moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes dull, their backs hunched. The room was filled with the scent of overcooked oatmeal and old linoleum. Across from her, a woman with thinning gray hair and a pale blue shawl stirred her food without eating it. Evelyn offered a small smile. "Good morning," she said. The woman didn't answer. She blinked slowly, like the sound had to travel a long way to reach her. Later, Evelyn tried to stop one of the orderlies in the hallway, a stocky man with dark circles under his eyes. "Excuse me," she began. "Can I see the administrator? Just to ask a few questions." He didn't break stride. "Administrator's not available today. When will she be?" "Don't know. Maybe next week." "Always next week." That night, Evelyn sat at the window with her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed. Something was wrong here. Deeply wrong. This wasn't a place for rest. It was a place to forget, and to be forgotten. She thought of Melissa, of the clipped way she said, "You'll get everything back when you leave." But Evelyn was no fool. That girl, her daughter, hadn't looked back once, hadn't called, hadn't even left a number. At exactly 11:15 p.m., she heard footsteps in the hallway, but not the heavy clinical gait of a nurse or guard. These were softer, almost cautious, pausing just outside her door. Then came a knock, gentle, tentative. She stood slowly, yes. The door cracked open just a few inches. A boyish face peeked in, young, no more than 25, with tousled dark hair, sharp cheekbones and eyes too tired for his age. "Hey," he said in a low voice. "You okay in here?" Evelyn blinked. "Who are you?" He stepped in, glancing over his shoulder first. "Name's Noah. I do nights. Laundry maintenance, stuff like that. I saw you didn't eat dinner. Figured maybe you'd want some tea." In his hand he held a paper cup. Steam curled up from it, thin and fragrant. "Chamomile." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Put it on the table." He did. She noticed his hands calloused, scarred, honest. He looked around. "Not much of a room, huh? Reminds me of my old basement," she said, "but colder." That earned a quiet chuckle. Noah sat on the small stool near the desk, elbows on knees. "You're Evelyn, right?" She nodded. "I heard about you. The new one, the one who doesn't just shuffle around like the rest." "That's supposed to be a compliment." He smirked. "More than most people around here get." Evelyn sipped the tea. It was too hot, but she didn't mind. You shouldn't be in here, should you? Nope. Then why are you? He scratched the back of his neck. Guess I just hate seeing people treated like ghosts. That made Evelyn pause. She looked at him more carefully now. The nervous energy, the darting eyes, the way his voice stayed just above a whisper. This wasn't just a kind gesture. You know something, she said. He didn't answer right away. Then yeah, a little. Evelyn sat straighter. Tell me. Noah looked around again, then lowered his voice even more. This place isn't what it pretends to be. It used to be a real wellness center before they changed ownership last year. Now it's just storage. Families drop off their old folks, sign the papers, and that's it. No calls, no visits. Just money wired every month. Jesus, she breathed. My mom was one of them, he said, staring down at the floor. 3 years ago, different place, same idea. My aunt signed the forms and disappeared. By the time I found her, she'd stopped speaking. Just faded, like someone unplugged her soul. Evelyn felt something pull tight in her chest. I work here because I want to know how it happens, Noah continued. And maybe if I'm lucky, help someone before they disappear too. Evelyn studied him, the rawness in his voice, the anger barely contained beneath the kindness. This wasn't charity. This was personal. You picked the right room, she said. Noah met her eyes. So you're not planning to stay? She gave a wry smile. Not if I can help it. A long pause stretched between them. Then Evelyn leaned forward. Melissa, my daughter, dropped me here. Said it was a retreat. A few days, she promised. But they took my phone, my wallet, everything. The nurses dodge my questions and no one's told me when I can leave. She signed the release documents. She did something. The nurse had a clipboard full of forms. I didn't see what she signed. Noah nodded grimly. They make it look clean on paper. But they exploit trust fast. If she signed power of attorney or asset transfer agreements, and you're here long enough without protest, it's hard to undo. Evelyn's fingers gripped the mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wants the house, she said slowly. The land. My pension. That's why she smiled so sweetly. That's why she planned this so carefully. Noah swallowed. Then we have to act fast. Evelyn looked at him, something like fire flickering in her chest. She had spent the last 48 hours in a fog of doubt, fear, betrayal. But now it all snapped into place like puzzle pieces. Melissa hadn't just abandoned her. She'd buried her. And Evelyn wasn't ready to be buried. Can you get into the staff files, she asked. Noah nodded. I've seen the database. Names, intake forms, signed documents. They keep it on a locked laptop in the admin office, but I've copied stuff before. You'll find my name, she asked. I'll try. Evelyn exhaled. And when we find it, we get me out of here. Noah looked surprised by the steel in her voice. You're not scared? I'm furious, she said. I've given that girl everything. My love, my savings, my entire damn life, and she's turned me into a business transaction. She stood now slowly, her back creaking but proud. But she forgot something. What's that? Noah asked. I'm still here, and I remember how to fight. Noah stood too. Then let's get to work. He turned to leave, but Evelyn caught his arm. Why did you really come tonight? She asked. He hesitated. Because when I looked in your eyes, you didn't look broken. Evelyn held his gaze. Neither do you. Then he slipped out the door, silent as smoke. Evelyn sat back on her bed, her pulse racing. She looked at the window again. The wind howled, but it no longer felt like it was howling at her. It felt like it was howling with her, a wild call in the night. She wasn't alone anymore, and she wasn't staying. Tomorrow the real escape would begin. It started with a whisper, not a word, but a rustle of fabric and caution as Noah slipped into Evelyn's room just past midnight. Rain tapped against the window in a slow, deliberate rhythm, a symphony of shadows playing across the peeling walls. The storm had come early, just as he'd hoped. He carried a battered laptop tucked under one arm, and in the other a thermos of hot coffee. His hoodie was soaked, his boots muddy, but his eyes held a grim sense of purpose. I got in, he whispered. Evelyn sat up, her heart thudding. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her fingers already trembling with anticipation. Show me. Noah set the laptop on the desk and pulled up a folder labeled Intake E. Carter. Beneath it, a list of scanned documents populated the screen one by one: consent forms, medical waivers, dietary requests, and then the one that made Evelyn's breath catch. Power of attorney Melissa Carter signed, notarized, time-stamped. Below it, real estate transfer agreement prepared, pending. Evelyn's voice came out as a rasp. She did, Noah said softly. Her hands curled into fists on her lap. Her chest rose and fell sharp and ragged, but her voice when it came was flat steel wrapped in frost. She's selling my house. She submitted the sale authorization yesterday, Noah said. It's being processed through a third-party broker, someone tied to her husband's real estate firm. Off-market, quiet deal. Evelyn leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen like it was something foul. That's why she smiled when she took my purse. She already knew. She just needed my absence to be official. They've kept others here the same way, Noah said. I've seen the pattern. Family member gets legal control, patients get parked here. Weeks pass, sometimes months. By the time anyone comes looking, if they ever do, it's too late. Evelyn's knuckles turned white on the edge of the desk. She's trying to erase me. Noah didn't respond. The weight of the truth hung too heavy for words. Print it, she said. Noah hesitated. We don't have a printer here, not one that's unmonitored, but I can transfer the files to a flash drive. Then do it. He nodded and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small drive wrapped in duct tape. This one's clean. No trace, no metadata. It'll look like a power outage if anyone tracks it. She watched him work in silence, her breath still shallow. Her mind was racing, but she forced herself to stay still. This wasn't the time to unravel. This was the time to gather threads. Do you have access to security footage? She asked. Only live feed, he said. No stored files, they run everything off a private loop. I can't access previous days unless I'm on the admin machine. Evelyn nodded slowly. That's fine. We don't need the past. We're building our own record. She opened the drawer by the bed and pulled out a tiny digital recorder, one she'd found hidden in the lining of her coat, slipped there by instinct the day Melissa came to pick her up. She'd carried it for years, just in case. You came prepared, Noah said, raising a brow. Always, she muttered. Start with the intake nurse. Her name's Janice. Noah looked impressed. You want me to record them? No. I'll do it. But I'll need you to keep them talking, get them in conversation, buy me time. I need their voices on this thing. I want everything documented: tone, language, intimidation, even hesitation, especially hesitation. You sure you're up for that? Evelyn gave a tight smile. Noah, I raised a child who could lie without blinking. I know how to listen between the lines. Noah passed her the flash drive. Hide this somewhere safe. She took it and slipped it beneath the mattress, taping it beneath one of the loose slats with trembling fingers. Outside, the storm intensified. Thunder rolled in the distance, low and bitter. Noah stood. We don't have long. The night rotation changes at 4. That's when security resets and logs timestamps. I can sneak you into the utility wing. There's an emergency exit there locked with a keypad, but I know the code. If we're going to do this, it has to be soon. Evelyn stood slowly. We're not going yet, not without more. You want more evidence? I want enough to burn this whole place down if I have to. Noah gave a single nod. Tomorrow, during meds and group time, I'll create a distraction. You record everything. Stick close to Janice or one of the assistants. I'll handle the rest. He moved to leave, but Evelyn caught his sleeve. Why are you helping me? Noah paused. The light flickered again. My mother used to say the worst kind of prison isn't made of bars. It's made of silence, he said. You remind me of her. But she didn't get out in time. Evelyn looked at him, really looked. And for the first time since Harold passed, she felt something like trust. I'm not going down quietly, she said. Noah gave a half smile. That's what I was counting on. He slipped out into the corridor and Evelyn moved to the window, watching the trees sway in the wind, their limbs scratching the sky like fingers clawing for escape. By morning she was ready. The hallway buzzed with artificial life, overhead lights flickering, shoes squeaking on the linoleum, nurses making small talk with each other while ignoring the residents. Evelyn wore her robe like armor, her recorder clipped beneath the lapel. She sat at breakfast with Janice, who stood behind her passing out cups of water and pills. Evelyn turned slowly. Good morning, Janice. Janice offered a tight nod. I was wondering. Could you remind me of what my daughter signed? I never got to see the paperwork. Janice froze for a half-second. It was enough. Oh, I believe it was the standard suite of authorizations, she said smoothly. Medical consent, temporary guardianship, financial oversight. Everything legal and above board. Financial oversight, Evelyn repeated, letting the surprise coat her voice like honey. That's interesting. I thought it was just a weekend visit. Janice's smile thinned. Sometimes people misunderstand the paperwork. Happens often. That's why we review everything thoroughly during check-in. I didn't sign anything. Well, Janice said, adjusting her clipboard, your daughter did. She has full permission. Evelyn tilted her head. That's odd. My lawyer never mentioned anything about that. Janice stiffened again. Another note for the recorder. Oh, Evelyn added sweetly. And I'd like to write to my lawyer today. Or call him. I'd prefer that. Janice hesitated just slightly. I'll need to check with the administrator. Of course. By midday, Evelyn had collected 3 more fragments of conversation, each one confirming her suspicion they were stalling her intentionally. No one intended for her to leave anytime soon. That night, as promised, Noah returned this time with a set of old keys, a map scrawled on a notepad, and a bag of supplies. Water crackers, a raincoat, gloves, and a burner phone. Phone's clean, no GPS, prepaid, you'll have 1 call. She looked down at the flip phone, her hands trembling slightly. You sure you're ready? He asked. I was ready the day she took my name off the mailbox. They moved fast. Through the service hall, past the laundry bins and industrial dryers, Evelyn clung to the shadows like a second skin. She kept her head low, her steps slow but deliberate. The hallway smelled of bleach and rust. They reached the emergency exit. Noah punched in the code 0429. The lock beeped twice and clicked open. I picked your birthday, he said. Evelyn blinked. You remembered? You mentioned it once, second day we talked. He opened the door and the wind slapped them both across the face. The rain had turned into a light drizzle, the storm breaking into something gentler. Moonlight shimmered faintly behind the clouds. This leads to a footpath behind the orchard, Noah said. It curves around the side of the property and ends near the old maintenance road, about a mile. Evelyn stepped into the rain, the hood of the coat up, the burner phone clutched tight. Noah, she said, turning back. When I get out, I'll make sure this place gets investigated. You won't have to keep sneaking around anymore. Noah gave her a sad smile. It's not just about this place. He looked up at the sky. It's about people forgetting the ones who raised them. She nodded once. Then she walked. Each step forward felt like pulling herself out of a grave someone else had dug for her. The earth was soft beneath her feet, her shoes sinking slightly into the mud. But she kept going, gripping the edge of the trees for balance, for strength. By the time she reached the service road, her clothes were soaked, her legs shaking, but she was standing. She flipped open the phone and dialed the only number she could remember without hesitation. Helen picked up on the first ring. Evelyn, she breathed. Is that you? It's me, Evelyn said, voice cracking. She tried to bury me, Helen, but I'm still breathing. I'll find you, Helen cried. Just tell me where you are. Evelyn looked at the orchard behind her, at the twisted branches, the empty windows of the institution fading into the mist. I'm almost home, she whispered, but first I need to take everything back. And with that she took the first real step toward justice, toward vengeance, toward freedom. The rain had slowed to a whisper by the time Evelyn Carter and Noah emerged from the edge of the orchard. The narrow service road beneath their feet was slick with mud and scattered pine needles, but the air had sharpened with resolve. Somewhere behind them the walls of whispering pines still loomed, but Evelyn didn't look back. Her legs ached each step, a small rebellion against time, age, and betrayal. Noah walked beside her silently, only breaking stride to offer her a steadying arm when the trail dipped or rose. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them didn't need to be filled. It pulsed with shared clarity. They were no longer escaping a building, they were escaping erasure. After nearly an hour, just as Evelyn's lungs began to burn from the cold, a crooked wooden sign came into view. It read, Pine Rock Motor Inn Vacancy, in peeling red paint. A lone fluorescent light buzzed over the door, throwing shadows against the fog. Noah led the way to the front office. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, and the warmth inside wrapped around Evelyn like an old quilt. Behind the counter sat a heavy-set man in a thermal vest, half asleep, watching an old western on a tube TV. "Need a room?" he asked, barely looking up. "Cash," Noah replied, pulling a folded envelope from his coat. "One night. No questions." The man grunted and pushed a clipboard across the desk. Noah scribbled fake names and handed over the money. Moments later, they were inside room 6, a small, musty unit with floral curtains and a heater that hummed like it was trying not to wake the walls. Evelyn dropped into the chair by the window. Her legs trembled, but her mind was clear. "I need a phone," she said. Noah handed her the burner. Her fingers were stiff wet with sweat despite the cold, but they knew the number by heart. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Raspy, cautious, but steady. "This is David Farrow." "It's Evelyn." A beat of stunned silence. "Evelyn." The voice sharpened. "Where the hell have you been? I got some strange notifications. 2 real estate queries with your signature. Your daughter said you were on a spiritual retreat." She lied. And then she told him everything, not in trembling confession, but in clipped, steel-edged sentences. Evelyn Carter was no longer the woman who waited for things to happen. She was the woman who had walked herself out of a prison. "She's trying to sell the house, David, and she has power of attorney. I need you to stop that sale. I need you to challenge that authority immediately." David took a breath. "Do you have evidence?" "I do, and I have help." "Where are you?" "Pine Rock Motor Inn, room 6. Don't come here yet. Just do what you need to do. I'll call again once I'm safe." When she hung up, Noah handed her a second piece of paper, another number scrawled in his messy handwriting. "Your neighbor. You mentioned her. The one who always brought you peaches from her tree." Marjorie Evelyn whispered, eyes softening. "Yes." She dialed. The phone rang longer this time. Then came the voice, thin but unmistakable. "Hello, it's Evelyn." "Good Lord." Marjorie's voice cracked. "Evelyn, I thought your daughter told everyone you were at a retreat, some kind of cleanse. But then I saw a man in a suit walking through your living room yesterday. He had a clipboard." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "She's selling it." "I knew it." Marjorie gasped. "I knew something was off. I can keep watch, honey. I still have the outdoor camera from when my shed got broken into. I'll check the feed right now. Please record anything unusual, especially if someone goes into my study." "You got it." Noah from the corner opened his laptop. "I think I can get into the camera system," he said. "You had smart home monitoring, right?" Evelyn nodded. "Harold installed it. I never figured out how to use it properly." He typed quickly, hunched over like a code breaker. The screen flickered, and then there it was. A live feed from Evelyn's house. The living room came into view first. The sofa, the bookshelf, the fireplace she hadn't seen in days. It was all there, still quiet, but unmistakably hers. And then movement. Melissa. She swept into frame like she owned it, wearing a cream turtleneck and gold earrings. She walked with that same bounce Evelyn remembered from her teenage years, only now it was exaggerated, rehearsed. She wasn't alone. A man followed behind her, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a Bluetooth headset and a leather folder. He scanned the room with a buyer's eye, taking notes, pointing at things. Melissa gestured toward the walls, the fireplace, the window seat Harold had built with his bare hands. "She's showing it off," Evelyn said softly, "like she earned it." Noah didn't speak. On the feed, Melissa opened a drawer in the hallway cabinet, pulled out a folder. Evelyn's voice turned to ice. "That's where I kept Harold's pension documents." Melissa didn't even glance at them. She tossed them onto the table like junk. "I have to hand it to her," Evelyn murmured. "She's thorough." Then something strange happened. Melissa turned to the man and said something, lips forming slowly enough for Noah to rewind and replay the feed. He turned on the auto-captioning feature. Melissa's words came up on screen, just 5 simple ones. "She won't be back ever." Evelyn's chest clenched. Not might not, not probably not. Ever. That single word settled like ash in the pit of her stomach. "She thinks she's buried you," Noah whispered. Evelyn's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "No," she said, "she knows what she's done." The camera cut to the foyer. Melissa handed the man a business card. They shook hands. He left. She turned off the lights and walked out like she'd just locked up a museum. Noah shut the laptop slowly. "We have to move fast." Evelyn stared into the screen long after it had gone black. Her home had been reduced to footage. Her daughter to a stranger playing dress-up with someone else's life. But she wasn't crying. She was calculating. "I want to go back," she said. To the house, Noah asked. "No, not yet. I want to go through this the right way, with evidence, with support. I want her to see me in court on paper wherever it hits hardest, but first, I need to be safe." Noah stood. "I'll call someone I trust. He knows how to move people without raising alarms. You have that kind of connection." He gave her a half smile. "You're not the only one with secrets." As he stepped out into the night to make the call, Evelyn turned toward the window. She wiped a circle in the foggy glass and stared out into the dark. Her house, her history, her memories, and a daughter who had decided to sell it all for comfort. But Evelyn wasn't a memory. She wasn't a line on a spreadsheet. She was a storm, and she had just figured out how to strike. She whispered to the night, "You'll see me again, Melissa." And this time she would be the one holding the clipboard. The road to the house twisted through the hills like a forgotten memory, and Evelyn Carter followed it in silence. The night was still and sharp, the kind that carved its way into your lungs with every breath. Noah had dropped her off at the base of the gravel path, headlights off engine, barely a hum. She'd told him not to wait. This part, this crossing of lines, she needed to do alone. With her hood pulled low and Harold's old coat buttoned up to her chin, Evelyn crept through the underbrush beside the driveway, avoiding the motion lights she herself had helped install decades ago. She knew this land. Every knot in the trees, every dip in the gravel, it was hers before it was Melissa's fantasy. She moved like wind among shadows. And then it appeared. The house, her house. But it was no longer dressed in warmth or memory. It stood like a stage set, lights off curtains, drawn blinds too perfectly straight. A plastic "for sale" sign was stabbed into the earth at the end of the walkway, its red and white logo mocking her like a billboard in a graveyard. She crouched behind the rose bushes, now dying, and watched. No movement. She moved up the path, careful not to disturb the gravel. Every window was dark. No cars in the driveway. The porch light was off, a subtle cruelty. That light had always been on for Harold. For Melissa when she stayed out too late. For neighbors. For hope. Not anymore. She stepped onto the porch. It creaked. Just slightly. The sound hit her like a whisper from the past. She froze, heart hammering. Then from beneath the third potted plant, exactly where Melissa had once hidden her diary key as a teenager, Evelyn retrieved the spare. It still worked. The door opened with a reluctant groan, hinges aching like old bones. She slipped inside, closed it gently behind her, and stood in the foyer, staring into the ghost of her life. Everything was too clean. The hall table had been cleared. No photos, no bowl of mints. Harold loved. The rug was gone. The scent of lemon cleaner masked the cedar warmth that used to greet her every time she came home. Even the ticking of the wall clock had stopped. It hung frozen at 6:17 like time itself had given up trying. She stepped forward, her boots sinking slightly into the polished floorboards. Every room had been stripped to its bones. Chairs gone, bookshelves emptied, curtains replaced with sterile beige. A house meant for listing, not for living. She walked slowly into the living room. The fireplace had been scrubbed clean. No soot, no ashes, just a hollow mouth with nothing left to say. Her knees trembled, but she didn't sit. Instead, her eyes drifted to the corner of the room, to the spot where Harold had always placed the armchair he called his ship. She could still see him there in her mind, nursing tea, humming Sinatra under his breath, tapping his fingers against the armrest, like he was steering something none of them could see. And then her breath caught in her throat. She remembered. That birthday, Harold's 65th. The house had been full of laughter. Melissa, still in her 20s then, had brought her boyfriend at the time, and Evelyn had spent the entire morning baking his favorite lemon cake. The fireplace crackled. A jazz record played softly in the background. Harold had danced with her in the middle of the room. No music, just memory, his hands rough but gentle, his voice whispering, "Still the only woman I ever see." She remembered how they'd laughed when the lights flickered. The fuse box always misbehaved during storms, and how Melissa had rolled her eyes, declaring the house too old-fashioned. Back then, Evelyn thought it was just a phase. Now she knew it had been prophecy. She moved through the kitchen cleaner than she'd ever kept it empty of spice of mess of Harold's tomato jars. The stove gleamed. The table was gone. Only the outline of where it had stood remained in the worn grain of the floor, a silent echo of thousands of meals' arguments and quiet forgivenesses. She leaned against the counter, eyes burning, and still she didn't cry, because then came another memory, older, deeper. The night Melissa was born. Snow outside. A hospital far from town. Evelyn had labored for 13 hours in the dull glow of fluorescent light, clutching Harold's hand like it was the only solid thing left in the world. When Melissa finally came red-faced, screaming, Evelyn had whispered the first promise of her life. "You will never be unloved. You will never be erased." She had meant it with every bone in her body, and now that child had tried to wipe her off the page. Evelyn turned from the kitchen and moved slowly to the hallway. Halfway down, she paused at the old mirror mounted beside the linen closet. Its frame was chipped, the glass a little warped, but it still held a reflection. She stared. She looked older, wilder, but not weak. "I will not let anyone erase this house," she whispered. "I will not let anyone erase me." And then she walked into the study. The door creaked open like it recognized her, reluctant to betray its last keeper. The room smelled different. Not bad, just unfamiliar, like someone had opened all the windows to let the soul out, but they hadn't succeeded. The desk was empty. The drawers had been rifled through, but Evelyn's fingers found what they were searching for, a loose panel beneath the lowest drawer. Inside it, the memory stick Harold had once used for family finances, and the miniature ledger she'd kept for years, handwritten each page a testament to thrift, sacrifice, and survival. She tucked both into her coat without hesitation. Then she turned and walked back into the living room, stopping in the exact center. There, bathed in a shaft of moonlight filtering through the front window, Evelyn lowered herself to the bare floor. The wood was cool, but not unfriendly. She crossed her legs, rested her hands in her lap, and closed her eyes. This was no longer a house for living. This was a house for reckoning. She listened to the silence, to the creaks and breaths of old beams. She imagined the voices that had once filled these walls, Melissa as a child, screaming with joy at Christmas morning. Harold's laugh, the music, the warmth, all of it woven into the grain of the floor beneath her. They had tried to stage her home for strangers, but they couldn't scrub the past away. "I built this place with memories," she said aloud. "You can paint over them, you can empty the shelves, but they're in the foundation. You'd have to burn it down to kill them." She sat there for nearly an hour, motionless, letting the moonlight wash over her like a baptism. And then finally she stood. One last glance around the hollowed-out room, one last breath. Then she walked out of the front door, locked it behind her, and returned the key beneath the pot, not out of habit, but out of defiance. The sign in the yard read "For sale." But Evelyn Carter was not for sale, and neither was her past. She disappeared into the night, just as the wind began to pick up again, carrying her vow back through the windows she'd once washed by hand, through the chimney that still remembered Harold's fire, through the attic that held a wedding dress and a forgotten lullaby. They hadn't erased her. They had only reminded her what was worth fighting for. The old law office hadn't changed since the last time Evelyn Carter had stepped through its door. Same cracked tile near the umbrella stand, same ticking wall clock, same faint scent of paper, ink, and dusted-off justice. But this time she didn't walk in as someone needing help. She walked in ready for war. David Farrow stood when she entered. The seasoned attorney had once been Harold's chess partner, and in a past life he'd defended farmers in land disputes and widows against fraud. His hair had thinned and his eyes bore the fatigue of too many settlements, but when he saw Evelyn, they sharpened. "You look like hell," he said, not unkindly. "Good," Evelyn replied. "I want Melissa to see me like this when I burn the ground beneath her." She pulled the small black recorder from her coat pocket and set it on his desk like a smoking gun. "What is it?" he asked. Her voice, Evelyn said, "threatening me, lying, taking." David pressed play. The tape hissed briefly. Then Melissa's voice spilled into the room, smooth and syrupy. "It's all done, Mom. You're not thinking clearly. The house will sell quickly. Trust me, this is what's best for everyone." "Then, you've signed everything already. Whether you remember or not doesn't matter anymore." David's face darkened. "I have copies of the forged documents," Evelyn continued. They altered my signature. Backdated authorization for medical custody. I didn't consent to any of it. I was tricked and trapped. David nodded, jaw clenched. We'll challenge everything. First step is freezing all transactions connected to your name. Melissa's power of attorney is built on deceit. We'll shatter it. She's scheduled a private auction next week, Evelyn added. She's already showing the house. David was already pulling forms from a drawer. We'll file an emergency injunction. If we can prove intent to commit fraud, we can stop the sale and request full reinstatement of your legal capacity. Evelyn sat forward. I'm not just trying to stop the sale, David. I want to drag her lies into the daylight. A knock on the glass door interrupted them. Marjorie stepped in, cheeks flushed from the cold, an old camera bag slung over one shoulder. I brought what you asked for, she said breathlessly. Evelyn smiled. Come in, Marjorie. The two women hugged quick, firm, no frills, the way only old neighbors do when kindness is passed like bread in times of war. I set up a camera by my kitchen window pointed right at your place, Marjorie said, pulling out an SD card. Caught her bringing in people all week. She even made calls from your study, showed them your land title like it was a damn flyer. David inserted the card into his laptop. Evelyn watched as images clicked across the screen. Melissa unlocking Evelyn's front door. Melissa pouring wine for a man in a suit. Melissa flipping through Evelyn's old documents with a red pen in her hand. Jesus, David muttered. I've got date stamps, too, Marjorie added. Matches the day Evelyn was still in that damn place. How's that for unauthorized access? Evelyn's lips tightened. She was building her story while I was locked in a cell. The door creaked again. Noah. He entered soaked from rain, a satchel across his chest. His hoodie was pulled low, his face taut with tension and purpose. Sorry I'm late, he said. Had to wait for the shift change. He unzipped the bag and pulled out a folder. What's that? David asked. Whispering Pines personnel files, Noah said, spreading the documents across the table. These are copies of falsified intake forms. Evelyn's files were altered after admission. This page here, he pointed to one document, claims Evelyn was diagnosed with early onset cognitive decline. No medical exam was ever performed. David's eyes widened. And who signed off on it? Noah tapped the signature, Janice Redwell, the intake nurse. Her. But she wasn't certified to issue medical recommendations. That right belongs to a licensed physician, who, by the way, hasn't been at the facility in over 4 months. He then handed over 2 short affidavits. What are these? Evelyn asked. 2 night shift workers, Noah said. I got them to talk. They've both seen residents coerced into signing documents. One of them saw your daughter hand-deliver envelopes to Janice labeled personal. David leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face for the first time. You've built a case, a good one. Evelyn crossed her arms. We're not done. David chuckled. No, we're just getting started. He looked at Noah. You've risked a lot bringing this here. Noah shrugged. She saved herself. I just made sure the door was open. David began stacking the documents, organizing them into labeled folders. I'll submit this package to the court tomorrow morning, he said. We'll request a motion to suspend the power of attorney, freeze all assets, and place a temporary hold on the house sale. Once that's secured, we'll file for formal charges, elder abuse, fraud, and property manipulation. Evelyn nodded. Good, but I want more than court filings. David raised an eyebrow. I want to be there, she said. At the auction, when she stands up in front of those buyers smiling like she owns me. I want to be in the room when she sees I'm not a ghost. David stared at her for a long beat. Then he nodded. We'll time it right, he said. Wait until the moment her confidence peaks. Then we show up with the injunction, the affidavit, and the media if you're feeling theatrical. Oh, I'm past feeling, Evelyn said. This is theater. This is the final act. Marjorie reached over and squeezed her hand. She won't get away with it. She doesn't get to rewrite your story. Noah's voice was quiet but certain. She tried to bury you, but you're the storm coming back to life. David stood. I'll draft the paperwork tonight. I'll need Evelyn's formal statement in the morning. And signatures. I'll be here, she said. They packed up in silence, each person feeling the gravity of what was about to unfold. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streetlights cast long shadows over the sidewalk, pooling light like stage spots in an empty theater. Evelyn stepped out last, pulling her coat tighter, lifting her chin to the night sky. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was building her own battleground. It was the kind of morning Melissa Carter had dreamed about since childhood. Center stage eyes on her and power blooming in her chest like a second heartbeat. The sun bathed the front of Evelyn's house in golden light, the lawn freshly trimmed, the porch swept clean, and a velvet rope strung across the entrance like a red carpet premiere. A small crowd of invited bidders men in tailored suits, women in sleek sunglasses gathered near the hedges, murmuring approval as they sipped complimentary coffee from a catering cart. Melissa stood by the front door, clipboard in hand, dressed in a cream blazer and matching heels. Her smile was tight, professional, but unmistakably smug. She welcomed each new arrival with a rehearsed air of charm, nodding at their questions, laughing lightly at their compliments. "Custom woodwork," she said to a man inspecting the porch railing. "All original. My mother insisted on doing things the old-fashioned way." When a younger couple asked about the attic, she replied, "Great for renovations. We've already submitted permits for expansion. It's ready for a modern touch." No one asked where the owner was. No one thought to, because Melissa had crafted this moment perfectly. Her narrative was airtight mother in spiritual retreat house, too much to maintain family looking to pass on a legacy. Legacy. That was the word she'd used in every pitch email. That was how she'd framed her betrayal. By 10:15 a.m., the auctioneer arrived, short, balding, and flustered, carrying a packet of papers and an air of urgency. Melissa greeted him like an old friend and led him up the steps, her heels clicking like the countdown to triumph. Inside the house, she moved with the grace of ownership. She fluffed the cushions, adjusted the lighting, turned on the music, low-volume jazz Harold would have hated. She didn't even flinch as she walked past the fireplace, past the photo shelf she'd emptied weeks ago. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a transaction. Out on the lawn, the auctioneer cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. This is a rare opportunity, charming countryside property, rich history, strong foundation, and immediate availability. We're starting the bidding shortly, but first the seller, Ms. Melissa Carter, would like to say a few words." Melissa stepped forward, smiling like the world belonged to her. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice smooth, confident. "This home has been part of my family for decades. My mother poured her heart into this place, every room, every nail. But as time goes on, we all face changes, transitions." She looked down, feigning a moment of sentiment. She made the decision to let go, to pass it on to someone who would breathe new life into it. Today, that someone might be you. A few heads nodded, someone even clapped. And then the crowd stirred. A murmur passed through the bidders like wind cutting across still water. Heads turned. Someone stepped aside, and Melissa froze. Evelyn Carter was walking up the driveway, not shuffling, not stumbling, walking, head high, coat buttoned, a leather folder clutched in one hand, her cane tapping with steady rhythm in the other. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the lawn. Evelyn stepped across the velvet rope like it wasn't there, her eyes locked onto her daughter. Not rage, not pleading, just steady, merciless recognition. "Good morning," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Melissa's face went pale. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," Evelyn replied. The silence was immediate, electric. The auctioneer looked between the two women, confused. "Miss Carter, I thought." "You thought wrong," Evelyn said. "This property is not for sale." Melissa stepped toward her, voice low, teeth clenched. "Mom, don't do this here, please." Evelyn turned to the crowd. "I apologize for the confusion. There's been a misunderstanding. One that involves forged documents, illegal transfer of power of attorney, and coercion of a vulnerable elder. That elder would be me." Gasps. A man with a briefcase stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. David Farrow. Crisp suit. Calm eyes. He held up a manila envelope. "My name is David Farrow, attorney of record for Mrs. Evelyn Carter. This morning we filed a legal injunction halting any sale or transfer of this property, citing multiple counts of fraud, manipulation, and elder exploitation." He passed the envelope to the auctioneer, who opened it with trembling hands. Evelyn turned back to Melissa. "Do you want to tell them?" she asked. Melissa's voice broke. "You weren't supposed to be here." "No," Evelyn said. "You were counting on me being too weak, too isolated. You put me in a room and called it kindness. You stripped my life down to a pamphlet and thought no one would notice." Melissa shook her head. They're lies. You're confused. I was protecting you." Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small recorder. She pressed play. Melissa's voice crackled out into the open air. "You've signed everything already. Whether you remember or not doesn't matter anymore. The house will sell quickly. Trust me, this is what's best for everyone." The crowd fell silent again. A woman near the back lowered her coffee cup. The auctioneer's face turned ashen. David raised his voice. "As of this moment, any attempt to continue this auction will be considered a breach of court order and subject to prosecution. I advise all potential buyers to leave the premises immediately." A ripple of movement. Murmurs. Awkward goodbyes. Someone dropped a brochure. A man in sunglasses muttered Jesus before walking away. Within 2 minutes, the lawn was nearly empty. Melissa stood in the center, arms limp at her sides, face blank. Evelyn stepped forward, closing the distance. "This wasn't just about the house," she said. "It was about erasing me. About writing a version of events where you were the loving daughter and I was the relic in your way." Melissa's voice cracked. "I needed it. You don't understand what it's like trying to build a future while carrying someone else's past." Evelyn didn't blink. "Then you should have asked. You should have fought honestly. But you chose theft over truth. And now you're standing in the ashes of your own decisions." David stepped beside Evelyn, nodding. "Police reports will be filed today. A restraining order is pending. All financial activity linked to your name is being audited." Melissa looked around as if hoping anyone would intervene, but there was no one left. No friends, no buyers, no applause. Only her mother, only the truth. Evelyn turned away, her cane tapping once on the porch step as she climbed. David followed, nodding politely to the stunned auctioneer, and Melissa, for the first time in her carefully crafted adult life, stood alone on the lawn of the house she never truly owned, watching the door close on everything she thought was hers. Inside, Evelyn paused in the hallway. The light through the window was softer now, warming the floor like an old embrace. The house breathed again. Not for sale, not forgotten, and not defeated. The story spread like a slow-burning fire. It started as a headline buried on the second page of the county paper, "Daughter accused of fraud after attempted sale of elderly mother's home." Within 2 days, it had made its way to the local news circuit, then online forums, and finally, inevitably, to the morning coffee gossip loops in every kitchen and corner diner across the county. By the end of the week, Melissa Carter's name was no longer associated with community service or interior design consultations. It was associated with betrayal. The report was clinical and cold. Melissa Carter, under investigation for elder exploitation, attempted fraudulent real estate transaction, and unlawful possession of private assets. Her accounts had been frozen, her passport revoked. She'd been seen leaving the county courthouse with sunglasses on and lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. No one waved at her anymore. Her phone rang, but she didn't answer. She stopped going to yoga, and somewhere in that growing silence, the woman she tried to erase walked back into her house, keys in hand, head held high, and began again. Evelyn Carter stood in the middle of her living room, not the stripped-down version she had walked into under the cover of night, but the one that had lived in her bones for decades. The auction signs were gone, the velvet rope discarded, the plastic brochures with photos of her fireplace taken from flattering angles had been torn into strips and fed to the fire Harold had once built with his bare hands. The house was quiet but not empty. Sunlight poured through the front windows, brushing against the newly dusted baseboards. Boxes sat stacked by the walls full of things Melissa had packed away, as if memory were an inconvenience to hide in cardboard. Evelyn opened them one by one, hands gentle but firm, unwrapping every photo frame, every heirloom dish, every little piece of her life that had been deemed disposable. She didn't cry. She didn't curse. She cleaned. Every day that week she worked until her bones ached. She vacuumed every carpet, wiped every windowsill. She took a rag to the kitchen tiles and scrubbed out the lies. In the attic she found Harold's old record player. She set it up in the corner of the living room and played Billie Holiday until the house swayed with something soft and sorrowful. She replaced the clock battery. She brewed tea. She sat on the porch at dusk. And then the first knock came. A woman in her 70s stood at the gate clutching a printout of the newspaper article, hands shaking. She wore a threadbare coat and an old backpack slung over her shoulder. Her name was Lorraine. "I'm sorry," she said, voice barely audible. I read what happened. I didn't know where else to go." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She opened the gate and said, "Then you're exactly where you're supposed to be." The second came 2 days later. James, 81, who'd been living out of his car after his son kicked him out to convert the spare room into an office. Then Maria, 74, a former elementary school teacher whose granddaughter had sold her piano and disappeared. Then a woman named Ruth, who said nothing at all when she arrived, just stood on the porch with her eyes brimming and her hands empty. They came with duffel bags with stories half told and hearts half shattered. They came with no plan and no permission. But Evelyn knew. She knew what it was like to be discarded, gently erased with polite cruelty. She knew what it meant to wake up in a place meant to make you disappear. She knew the smell of silence designed to suffocate you, and the sound of betrayal that echoed in every drawer emptied by someone you once loved. So she opened the doors wider. She cleared out the upstairs rooms. She dusted the guest beds. She hung fresh curtains. Noah came every other day to help patch the roof, fix the heating, and repaint the chipped walls. Marjorie donated armchairs. David helped draft the paperwork to form a nonprofit. And Evelyn gave the place a name, the Attic of Light, a name that meant something more than just shelter. It meant warmth. It meant truth. It meant not being forgotten. The town began to notice. A reporter from the regional news drove out to interview Evelyn. She didn't give them drama. She gave them facts. She told the story with calm conviction, her voice clear, her eyes unwavering. She said, "People think the worst thing about getting old is your body giving out. It's not. It's being treated like your story is over, that your memories don't matter, that your home is just square footage." She gestured to the porch where Lorraine and James were planting morning glories in the garden bed. "I'm not saving anyone," Evelyn said. "I'm just giving them a place to keep being." Donations followed. Canned food, warm coats. A local carpenter offered to build a ramp for the back door. The community college sent students to clean gutters and read poetry. A retired nurse volunteered to visit weekly for wellness checks. And the house, once hollowed by greed, began to swell again with life. In the evenings, Evelyn sat at the dining table, Harold's chair beside hers, and listened as stories spilled from the walls. Lorraine talked about her first dance recital at age 9. James remembered the time he fixed a stranger's tire and got a peach pie in return. Maria recited poems in Spanish and laughed like a girl when someone complimented her handwriting. Even Ruth, silent at first, began humming in the garden. Eventually, she told them her daughter had moved to Florida and forgot to give her the new address. Evelyn didn't press. She just brewed more tea. One evening, as the sky turned lavender and gold, Evelyn stood at the window and watched the sun light up the garden. Ruth and Maria sat side by side on the porch swing. Noah hammered the last nail into a repaired window frame. Lorraine had just made scones. James was setting up a chessboard. And Evelyn whispered more to herself than to anyone else. She tried to sell this house like it was a thing, but it was never just lumber and nails. It was a heart, and I've sewn it back together. The doorbell rang. Another knock. Another story. Another reminder that memory could be home and healing could take root anywhere there was light. Evelyn opened the door again, and she smiled. The morning of the dedication was wrapped in gold. Sunlight spilled across the hill like liquid honey, warming the old wood siding of the house that once bore the weight of betrayal. Now it stood proud, no longer a prison of memory, but a home transformed. A hand-painted sign hung above the porch, the Attic of Light, simple, quiet, defiant. Evelyn Carter stood at the base of the steps in a navy blue coat, her silver hair swept back, her chin lifted to the sky. Her cane was in one hand, but she barely leaned on it. The other hand rested lightly on the shoulder of Maria, who held a bouquet of sunflowers. Reporters milled about near the flower beds, microphones in hand, their cameras aimed at the porch where folding chairs had been arranged in tidy rows. A small speaker crackled gently with old jazz. There were neighbors, volunteers, students from the community college, and even 2 city officials who'd come not for politics, but because they'd read the article that had gone viral, From Betrayal to Beacon, Elder Woman Turns Family Tragedy into Sanctuary. It wasn't the headlines that mattered to Evelyn. It was the way people looked at the house now with respect. She made her way up the steps slowly, deliberately. Noah stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, a quiet grin on his face. Marjorie dabbed her eyes with a wrinkled tissue as Evelyn reached the small podium set up by the front door. The breeze tugged at her coat. The wood beneath her feet felt warm. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, then paused. Let the silence settle. I never planned to be here, she said, her voice strong, unhurried. Not like this, not after everything. She looked out at the crowd, not past them, not above them, but into them. I wasn't rescued. I wasn't pulled from a fire or carried out of a storm. I walked out, one aching step at a time. Because I finally realized, she paused, voice low, I didn't need someone to save me. I just needed the chance to stand up. A murmur of affirmation passed through the crowd. She continued, This house was nearly sold out from under me. Not because I couldn't take care of it, but because someone decided I no longer mattered, that my memories were clutter, that my voice was too faint to be heard. She glanced toward the upstairs window, her old bedroom now painted fresh and filled with sunlight. Well, I'm louder than I've ever been, and I know now with painful clarity that the worst thing we can do is let the world tell us when we're finished. Evelyn looked at Maria, at James, at Ruth standing near the trellis with a basket of fresh herbs. This place isn't a retirement home, she said. It's a place to begin again, a place to belong, for anyone who's been discarded, overlooked, underestimated. The wind stirred again. Evelyn let the quiet speak for a moment. Then she smiled. We named it the Attic of Light because the world likes to put the elderly in storage, out of sight, out of mind. But attics, they hold the most valuable things: history, craft, love, survival, and now finally light. Applause rose like the rising sun itself, steady, earnest, echoing between trees and roof tiles. Evelyn stepped back from the podium. She didn't bow. She just smiled and turned to Noah, who gave her a subtle nod, the kind that said you did it without ever needing to speak. The ceremony gave way to laughter, lemonade stories. Evelyn watched Ruth teach a college volunteer how to fold bed sheets the proper way. Lorraine played cards with two retirees who had driven from the next county. James stood near the porch steps, sipping punch and describing what it felt like to fix a broken engine by sound alone. And Evelyn, she disappeared for a little while. Upstairs, her room smelled faintly of chamomile and lemon polish. The curtains danced in the breeze. She sat at her desk by the window, pulled out her leather-bound journal, and opened it to a clean page. She wrote, Today we opened the doors to a house that tried to forget itself. Today we planted something inside its bones. Laughter, dignity. The kind of defiance that grows like ivy even through stone. I stood in front of a crowd and spoke not as a victim, but as a woman reborn. I said I didn't need saving, and I meant it. She paused, then added, Melissa hasn't reached out. Maybe she never will. But the version of me she tried to erase is now painted on these walls, spoken in every new name that walks through the door. She didn't just fail to take this house. She made it immortal. Evelyn leaned back. The sun lit her face through the glass, a golden warmth that reminded her of afternoons with herald music on the radio, hands stained from planting spring bulbs. She closed her eyes and let it soak into her skin. Downstairs, laughter echoed from the kitchen. The scent of baked bread wafted up the staircase. Life, full, imperfect, persistent, pulsed through every floorboard. Later that evening, Evelyn sat on the porch with Ruth, James, and Maria. The swing creaked gently. A stray cat lay curled near their feet. They passed a bowl of blackberries between them. Ruth told a story about a boy who had once tried to steal her purse in 1986 and ended up mowing her lawn every summer after. Maria sang an old tune under her breath, her fingers tapping rhythm on the armrest. James leaned back, eyes half closed. You know what this feels like? Evelyn looked over. He smiled, like the world finally remembered we're still in it. The porch light flickered on, not out of habit, but because someone, maybe Noah, had thought ahead. Evelyn glanced up at the roof where soft golden beams poured through a small attic window. Light warmed the slats, spilled onto the porch, kissed the laughter in midair. She let her gaze stretch across the yard past the flower beds toward the fading sun. And then in a voice so quiet it almost wasn't real, she whispered, "I'm not here to reclaim the past. I'm here to build a future in light." The others didn't hear her, but the house did. And this time it didn't creak with grief. It stood tall in the evening glow, alive again.